At 19 years old, Evelyn Vance found herself standing on the frozen, wind-scoured perimeter of Oakhaven, completely destitute after the cruel directors of the county orphanage locked the heavy oak doors against her on the morning of her birthday. Her uncle, a bitter man who had promised to harbor her, instead vanished into the western goldfields, leaving her with nothing but $3 silver tucked into the lining of her threadbare wool cloak. Desperate for a roof against the impending Nebraska winter, she handed those last 3 coins to a dismissive land speculator for the deed to a ruined, long-abandoned icehouse on the edge of the creek. The townspeople shook their heads at the foolish girl, believing she would surely freeze inside a structure built solely to hold the dead weight of winter frost. Yet, beneath the rotting timber and the layers of forgotten sawdust, a secret lay buried deep within the earth, a discovery that would not only mend her broken spirit, but would ultimately mend the fractured heart of the entire valley. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Evelyn Vance. If you are watching this from a place that feels cold and forgotten, please take a moment to tell us your story in the comments below. To understand the quiet resilience that carried Evelyn through that bitter autumn, one must look back to the years before the orphanage took her in, to the small homestead her father had carved out of the stubborn prairie sod. Her father, Thomas Vance, was a carpenter by trade but a naturalist by inclination, a man who saw the structural integrity in a twisted cedar bough and the hidden architecture of the wild hills. From the time Evelyn could walk, he taught her how to listen to the language of the land, showing her how to identify the deep roots that held the soil together during the great droughts, and how to read the subtle shifts in the wind that signaled a coming blizzard. He did not leave her gold or land, but he left her an inheritance of observation, the ability to look at a piece of discarded timber and see the straight grain hidden beneath the weathered gray exterior. In their small cabin, surrounded by the scent of pine shavings and linseed oil, Evelyn learned the art of patience, watching her father spend days smoothing a single joint until it fitted perfectly, without a single nail. He would tell her that the things which held the world together were often the things that were completely hidden from view, buried deep within the joints of a house, or the silent corners of a human heart. Her mother, too, possessed a quiet wisdom, spending her evenings mending the town's discarded textiles, turning frayed wool coats into beautiful, intricate quilts that told the history of their family through every stitch. From her mother, Evelyn inherited a deep respect for things that had been cast aside, learning that a fabric was never truly ruined if one had the patience to find the strong threads that remained. These early years, though brief, forged in Evelyn a character as durable as the ironwood trees that grew along the riverbeds. When a sudden outbreak of the winter fever took both of her parents within a single week, leaving a 10-year-old Evelyn standing alone in the snow, she did not cry out or rail against the heavens. She simply folded her mother's last quilt, took her father's small pocket knife, and allowed the county authorities to lead her away to the orphanage in Oakhaven. For 9 years, she existed in that austere institution, a silent observer of the rigid discipline and the cold charity of the administrators, who viewed the children not as souls to be nurtured, but as burdens to be managed, until the day they could legally be turned out into the world. Through the long, lonely nights in the crowded dormitory, Evelyn held fast to the memories of the wood shavings and the quilt patches, keeping the warmth of her childhood alive like a small, shielded ember in the palm of her hand. The transition from the structured deprivation of the orphanage to the absolute vulnerability of the open road happened with a sudden, bureaucratic finality. On the morning of her 19th birthday, the headmaster, a severe man named Mr. Bradley, called Evelyn into his austere office, handed her a small canvas bag containing her few personal belongings, and informed her that her time under the county's care had officially expired. There was no word of blessing, no gesture of farewell. The door was simply opened, and the cold autumn wind ushered her out onto the muddy main street of Oakhaven. Her uncle's promised house, which she spent years imagining as a sanctuary, turned out to be an empty lot, the man himself having fled his debts months prior to join a wagon train heading toward the distant mountains. Standing in the center of the bustling frontier town, surrounded by farmers delivering their late harvest and merchants shouting their prices, Evelyn felt completely invisible, a ghost walking among the living. The wind grew sharper as the afternoon sun began its rapid descent toward the jagged western horizon, threatening a night of bitter frost that her thin cloak could never hope to repel. She wandered toward the edge of the settlement, where the grand brick buildings gave way to weathered sod houses, and eventually to the industrial refuse of the town's periphery. It was there, near the slow-moving waters of Willow Creek, that she encountered a land speculator named Silas Thorne, who was busy marking off plots of land that no one in their right mind wanted to buy. Thorne was a man who thrived on the misfortunes of others, acquiring tax-delinquent properties for pennies and selling them to unsuspecting greenhorns at a premium. As Evelyn approached his makeshift desk, her hands shivering in her pockets, Thorne eyed her with a mixture of amusement and calculations, realizing that she was exactly the kind of desperate soul he could exploit. When she asked if there was any structure, no matter how broken, that she could rent or buy for the $3 silver she possessed, Thorne laughed aloud, a dry, rattling sound that matched the dead leaves scraping across the dirt. He reached into his iron lockbox, pulled out a faded, water-stained deed, and told her that for $3 she could have the old Icehouse by the creek, a building that had been abandoned for over a decade after a structural collapse rendered it useless to the local meat packers. The townspeople who overheard the transaction chuckled softly into their coat sleeves, knowing that the Icehouse was a hollow shell of rotting pine, filled with decades of damp sawdust and mold, a place where the winter chill was preserved long into the summer months. To them, Evelyn was simply another tragic casualty of the frontier, a foolish girl who had traded her last remaining coins for a monument to coldness and decay. When Evelyn first pushed open the heavy, iron-strapped door of the Icehouse, the sound of the rusted hinges groaning against the silence felt like a warning. The interior of the building was a vast, subterranean cavern of shadows, designed to trap the cold and repel the sun, with thick double walls that had once been packed with charcoal and sawdust to insulate the great blocks of river ice. Now, those walls were weeping with moisture, the timber rotting from the inside out, and the air was thick with the suffocating scent of ancient river silt and decaying vegetation. The floor was covered in a deep, treacherous layer of grey sawdust, which muffled her footsteps and hid the structural decay beneath. Evelyn stood in the center of the gloom, her breath pluming in the damp air, realizing that the structure offered little more protection than a hollow log. Yet, as she began to clear a small space near the doorway to lay down her mother's quilt, her foot caught on a protruding piece of ironwork, causing her to stumble forward into the heavy dust. Brushing the grime from her hands, she looked down and noticed that the ironwork was not a loose nail or a discarded tool, but a massive, hand-forged ring bolt firmly anchored into a thick plank of white oak. Unlike the surrounding pine floorboards, which were soft with rot and gave way under her weight, this specific section of the floor was constructed from massive, seasoned timbers that remained remarkably solid despite the dampness. Intrigued by the anomaly, Evelyn used her father's pocket knife to scrape away the decades of impacted sawdust and river mud that filled the grooves around the oak planks. As the clean, dark lines of the wood emerged from the filth, she realized that she was looking at a hidden hatch, perfectly fitted into the floorboards, with the same precision her father had used in his finest carpentry work. The hatch was secured by a heavy brass padlock, green with age and corrosion, but the wood around the latch mechanism showed signs of deliberate reinforcing with iron plates. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she knelt in the dust, the coldness of the building forgotten as the ancient instinct of discovery took hold of her. She did not have a key, but she possessed the patience her father had taught her, and she spent the remaining hours of daylight meticulously working the tip of her knife into the rusted tumblers of the old lock, listening to the small, metallic clicks that echoed through the empty chamber until, with a sharp crack, the ancient mechanism finally yielded. Lifting the heavy oak hatch required every ounce of Evelyn's strength, the seasoned wood resisting her efforts until the hinges finally cleared the floor frame, revealing a narrow, stone-lined shaft that descended into the absolute darkness beneath the icehouse. The air that rose from the depths was completely different from the damp mold of the upper room. It was dry, cool, and carried the unmistakable, nostalgic scent of aged paper, dried lavender, and old leather. Holding a small candle stub she had salvaged from her canvas bag, Evelyn carefully lowered herself down the rough-hewn stone steps, her light flickering against walls that had been meticulously constructed from river stone to prevent any moisture from seeping into the chamber. At the bottom of the steps lay a small, vaulted room, no larger than a root cellar, completely insulated from the freezing temperatures above by the double layer of stone and earth. In the center of this hidden sanctuary sat a massive, iron-bound trunk of dark walnut wood, its surface pristine and untouched by the decay that had consumed the building above. Beside the trunk stood a small wooden desk, upon which rested a leather-bound journal and a single, beautifully preserved oil lamp, its reservoir still filled with clear, amber fluid. Evelyn lit the lamp, its warm, golden glow instantly dispelling the shadows and illuminating the contents of the chamber with a clarity that took her breath away. When she opened the journal, the elegant flowing script on the first page revealed the identity of the room's creator. It was Jonathan Vance, her grandfather, a man whom her father had always spoken of with a deep, reverent sorrow, a visionary surveyor who had helped lay out the original borders of the county before mysteriously vanishing into the territory decades earlier. The journal was not a record of wealth or conquest, but a meticulously detailed chronicle of the land's true history, containing the original, uncorrupted surveying maps and the foundational land deeds of the entire valley. As Evelyn turned the fragile pages, she discovered that her grandfather had not vanished. He had been systematically defrauded and driven out by a cabal of early settlers led by Silas Thorne's father, who had rewritten the town boundaries to steal the water rights and the fertile bottomlands from the original homesteaders. The trunk itself did not contain gold coins or sparkling gems, but something infinitely more valuable to the struggling community above: the original, legally binding land titles and a vast collection of seeds from hardy, drought-resistant heirloom grains that Jonathan Vance had spent a lifetime cultivating to ensure the survival of the frontier. The true significance of the discovery unfolded as Evelyn spent the subsequent days studying her grandfather's detailed notes, comparing his precise measurements with the current reality of the Oakhaven Valley. She realized that the chronic water shortages that had plagued the local farmers for the past decade were not the result of natural drought, but were entirely engineered by Silas Thorne and his associates, who had diverted the natural springs through illegal canals that were hidden behind artificial earthworks on Thorne's private property. The heirloom seeds in the trunk, preserved perfectly within the dry, constant temperature of the stone chamber, represented a forgotten agricultural lifeline, crops that could thrive in the harsh Nebraska climate without requiring the massive amounts of water that Thorne controlled and sold to the desperate farmers at extortionate prices. Evelyn understood that she was holding the key to the valley's salvation, but she also knew that a 19-year-old girl with no money and no standing in the community would be crushed instantly if she attempted to challenge the established power structure of Oakhaven directly. She began to work in secret, using the Icehouse as a cover for her operations, spending her nights carefully transcribing the original maps and preparing small, carefully measured packets of the heirloom seeds. During the day, she walked into the valley, visiting the most destitute farmsteads under the pretense of looking for odd jobs or sewing work, but using the opportunities to observe the soil conditions and to speak quietly with the farmers who were on the verge of losing everything to the bank. She met families who were surviving on nothing but boiled corn and hope, their fields withered by the artificial drought, and their spirits broken by Thorne's relentless collection tactics. To these desperate souls, Evelyn began to offer a strange, quiet hope, leaving small packets of the silver-grey grain seeds on their doorsteps, along with simple, handwritten instructions on how to plant them in the deep furrows where the moisture remained. She did not ask for payment, nor did she reveal the source of the seeds. She simply asked them to trust the old ways of the land and to keep the plantings hidden from the eyes of Thorne's land agents until the first harvest could be gathered. The quiet revolution that Evelyn had initiated did not remain unnoticed for long, as the strange, resilient green shoots of the heirloom grain began to appear in the fields of the poorest homesteaders, defying the dry dust that had claimed the standard crops. Silas Thorne, watching his control over the valley's food supply begin to slip, grew increasingly suspicious of the solitary girl who had transformed the ruined Icehouse into a clean, modest home, and who seemed to possess an unnatural confidence for someone who should have frozen weeks ago. One bleak November afternoon, Thorne arrived at the Icehouse, accompanied by the town sheriff, a man whose debts Thorne held, determined to find a reason to evict Evelyn and reclaim the property before she could uncover the secrets he suspected were hidden within its borders. He stormed into the building, his heavy boots kicking aside the neat piles of firewood Evelyn had collected, demanding to see her papers and accusing her of harboring stolen goods or conducting illegal business on the site. Evelyn stood before him, her small frame framed by the light of the doorway, her father's pocket knife resting quietly in her apron pocket, her expression as calm and unyielding as the river stone beneath her feet. When Thorne noticed the clean oak planks in the center of the floor and the heavy brass padlock that she had replaced on the hatch, his face grew pale with a sudden, vicious realization of what his father had always warned him might be buried beneath the old structure. He ordered the sheriff to break open the hatch, claiming that the property had been sold under false pretenses and that the contents of the ground belonged exclusively to the land company. The sheriff, looking at Evelyn's steady, dignified gaze and remembering the kindness she had shown his own sister during a recent illness, hesitated, his hand resting uncomfortably on his pistol belt as he questioned the legality of entering a private residence without a formal court order. The tension inside the damp room grew suffocating, the wind howling through the gaps in the wall as Thorne threatened to ruin the sheriff's career if he did not comply with the demand immediately. In that moment of extreme peril, when it seemed that all her grandfather's work would be confiscated and destroyed, Evelyn did not flinch. Instead, she looked past Thorne toward the open door, where a dozen local farmers had gathered, drawn by the sight of Thorne's carriage and carrying the very tools they used to work the stubborn earth. The arrival of the community transformed the confrontation from a private eviction into a public reckoning, as the farmers, led by a respected old homesteader named Caleb Vance, who was, unbeknownst to him, Evelyn's distant cousin, stepped into the Icehouse, their presence filling the space with an undeniable moral authority. Caleb looked at Thorne, then at the reinforced hatch, and finally at Evelyn, whose resemblance to the old surveyor Jonathan Vance became suddenly, undeniably apparent to the elders of the town, who remembered the early days of the settlement. Evelyn spoke then, her voice clear, resonant, and entirely devoid of fear, addressing not Thorne but the assembled farmers, explaining the true nature of the stone chamber beneath their feet and the legacy that had been preserved for them for over 30 years. She reached into her cloak and produced the original, uncorrupted surveying map, unrolling it across the oak floorboards so that everyone could see the clear, legal boundaries that proved Thorne's canals were built on stolen public land. The revelation struck the room like a thunderclap, the farmers crowding around the map with weathered hands pointing to their own properties, realizing that their years of suffering and debt had been the result of a massive, calculated fraud. Thorn attempted to bluster, threatening legal action and foreclosures, but his voice was drowned out by the deep, rising murmur of the community, which had found its collective strength after years of isolation and despair. The sheriff, recognizing that the legal authority had shifted irrevocably to the side of the truth, refused to assist Thorn any further, instead stepping forward to secure the original documents and ensuring that they would be safely delivered to the circuit judge, who was scheduled to arrive in the county seat the following week. Thorn was forced to retreat from the Icehouse, his carriage pursued by the cold wind and the silent, condemning stares of the people he had exploited for so long, his power over the valley broken not by violence, but by the simple, irrefutable truth preserved in the earth. The restoration of the Oakhaven Valley began that very winter, as the circuit judge formally validated the original maps and deeds discovered beneath the Icehouse, stripping Silas Thorn of his illegal landholdings and ordering the immediate removal of the artificial earthworks that had choked the natural springs. The water returned to the creek beds, a clear, rushing torrent that brought life back to the parched soil and filled the community's wells with sweet, cold water that had been denied them for a generation. The heirloom seeds that Evelyn had distributed produced an extraordinary harvest the following spring, their deep roots finding the restored moisture and yielding a hardy, golden grain that provided the community with both food and economic independence from the eastern syndicates. The ruined Icehouse itself was transformed by the hands of the grateful townspeople, who came together to repair its walls, replace its rotting timbers, and turn it into a permanent community library and seed exchange, a place where the history of the valley could be preserved and shared with future generations. Evelyn Vance remained the caretaker of that sacred space, no longer an outcast or an orphan, but the revered heart of a community that had learned to find its salvation in the things that had been written off as worthless. She lived in a small, warm cottage built adjacent to the stone chamber, her life surrounded by the murmur of children reading books and the steady, reassuring clatter of farmers sorting grain for the next planting season. The memory of her father's wood shavings and her mother's quilt remained alive in every corner of the restored building, a testament to the enduring truth that the most beautiful structures are built on foundations that cannot be shaken by the coldness of the world. Looking back on those bitter autumn days, when 19-year-old Evelyn Vance stood alone against the horizon, it is easy to see how the world might have judged her choice as a desperate foolishness. They saw only a broken girl paying $3 silver for a ruined icehouse that had been abandoned to the rot and the dark, never guessing that her resilience would uncover the very foundations upon which their survival depended. Her story reminds us that the true value of a life or a place is rarely found on the surface, but lies buried deep within the silent, patient corners that the world has forgotten to look at. Evelyn Vance showed a whole valley that even the coldest structure can become a source of enduring warmth when it is tended by a hand that knows how to find the straight grain beneath the weathered exterior. We want to thank you for spending this time with us today, and we hope this story brought a sense of warmth and perspective to your day. If you enjoyed this journey into the frontier past, please consider sharing it with someone who might need a reminder of their own hidden strength. Before we part, we leave you with this one question to carry with you. What is a time you found unexpected value or hope in something that others had completely written off as worthless? Until next time, stay close.